If you were born in the year 1200, you were born into a system that had already decided who you were long before your first breath. You weren't born into potential. You weren't born into choice. You were born into a place, a name, a task, and a burden. And none of it belonged to you. You came into the world in a hut, not a house, made of timber, mud, and thatch. The floor packed with years of dirt and ash and the skin flakes of everyone who came before you. Your mother didn't give birth lying in linen sheets. She squatted near the fire, gripping whatever she could reach while biting down on her own hand to muffle the sound. There was no midwife, no medicine, no water that hadn't already gone cold. And if you cried good, that meant you lived. That meant you could work someday. No one wrote your name down. No one marked the date. There was no paper, no pen, no calendar, and no need. You were one more mouth in a family that already didn't have enough to eat. One more pair of hands that might, in a few years, carry firewood, or gather herbs, or bend over in the same field where your father had bled into the soil for 3 decades. You were not baptized with fanfare. You were splashed with water from a wooden bowl if the priest came that week. If not, someone just said a prayer over your head and hoped it counted. And then life began. But not the kind of life you think of. There was no discovery, no dreams, no blank canvas, just repetition. Just the slow, gray spiral of days that all looked the same. You ate when there was food and you didn't when there was. You played with bones, rocks, sticks, until you were old enough to carry tools, and then the playing stopped. You learned to work before you learned to speak in full sentences. You were taught how to tie knots, how to kneel, how to wait in silence when the Lord rode by. You were taught to avoid eye contact with anyone who had better clothes than you. And you were taught, slowly but thoroughly, that you didn't matter. Not as a person, not as a soul. You were a body, a worker, a tithe, a potential tax. You lived on land that wasn't yours, in a house that wasn't yours, harvesting crops that weren't yours, under the rule of someone whose face you may never even see. You didn't vote, you didn't read, you didn't ask why. You were born into mud and labor and obligation, and you were told it was holy, that this station, this suffering, this submission was the natural order, that God Himself had made it so, that your humility was divine. And if you ever dared to ask, dared to imagine something different, you would be reminded, very quickly and very violently, that the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as intended. The cage wasn't hidden. It was all around you. It was your father's back, your mother's hands, the hunger in your belly, the silence at night. And the moment you learned to stop dreaming of anything else, that's when they knew the system had worked. You weren't a rebel. You weren't a failure, you were just a nobody, and that was exactly what they needed you to be. You didn't choose your life. The system chose it for you, and that system had a name, feudalism. A word you never said out loud because no one ever taught it to you, but you lived inside it. You breathed it, you worked it, you died in it. Feudalism wasn't just politics, it was air, it was gravity. It was everything you couldn't see but always felt. It began at the top with a king, a man so far removed from your world he may as well have been a ghost. You'd never meet him, never speak to him, but he owned everything, not in theory. In reality, the land, the rivers, the forests, the people, all his, but he didn't manage it himself. He handed it down to lords, barons, dukes, men who had proven loyalty or usefulness. These lords carved up the land like meat on a table and gave chunks to other men beneath them, knights, bailiffs, stewards, who then demanded everything from the people who worked it. That's where you came in. The bottom rung, the last name, the body in the field. You weren't a citizen, you weren't a worker, you were a serf or a villein or just the peasant, a human being legally tied to the land like an ox or a tree. You couldn't leave, not legally. If you tried, you could be hunted, fined, branded, beaten, returned like lost livestock, because to the law you weren't a free person. You were a resource. Your work wasn't paid, it was owed. You didn't get a wage. You got permission to exist in a hut on the Lord's land, eating from the edge of the field, surviving just enough to keep working. You plowed, you planted, you harvested, and you gave the best of it away. A portion went to the Lord. A portion went to the church. A portion went to taxes, fees, levies, obligations you didn't understand but still had to meet. And what was left, if anything, was yours. You worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day for grain you barely touched. And if the crop failed, if the weather turned, if disease hit your family, that was your problem. The system didn't protect you. It punished you. You still owed the same amount. You still had to appear. You still had to kneel. You couldn't sue. You couldn't negotiate. You couldn't write petitions. If you had a dispute, it went to the manor court, where the judge was appointed by the same man who collected your rent. The law wasn't blind. It was staring directly at you and daring you to speak out. So you didn't. Everything in your life was part of this system. The tools you used, the crops you grew, the woman you married, the taxes you paid, the wood you burned, the songs you sang. Even the day of rest, Sunday, wasn't yours. It belonged to God, which conveniently also meant it belonged to the church. You didn't rest because you earned it. You rested because they allowed it. And they made sure you knew. If you disobeyed, the land could be taken, the food withheld, the village turned against you. The feudal system wasn't messy. It was efficient, precise. It didn't need to put bars around your legs because it put rules inside your head. You didn't dream of leaving, not because you didn't want to, but because you never imagined it was possible. You were born into a cage. And every generation before you made sure you knew how to sit quietly inside it. In the year 1200, land was everything. It was power. It was law. It was wealth, status, food, safety, and survival all in one. If you had land, you could grow. If you had land, you could tax. If you had land, you could feed others and make them owe you for it. But if you had no land, you had nothing. And you had no land, not an acre, not a strip, not a single tree you could call your own. You might work the same plot of earth for 30 years, watch your children grow in its shadow, bury your dead in its edge, and still none of it was yours. Not legally, not spiritually, not in any way that mattered. The soil you bled into belonged to someone else. The seeds you planted were counted by someone else. The harvest you reaped was weighed and measured by a steward with cleaner hands and colder eyes, writing numbers you couldn't read. You couldn't leave that land without permission. You couldn't sell what came from it unless your lord got his share first. You couldn't build on it, couldn't pass it on. If you died, your son had to pay a fee to continue farming the same land you'd already worked into your grave. If he couldn't pay, the land went to someone else. No ceremony, no regret, just transfer, because you weren't a landowner. You were part of the land, legally tied, economically bound, spiritually taught to accept it as your place in the divine order. The noble class never touched the dirt, but they drew its borders on parchment you would never see. They married into more land. They waged wars over hedgerows and rivers. They gave land as dowries, as favors, as rewards. To them, land was chess. To you, it was the box you died inside. If a lord lost land in a war, you lost everything. If he was excommunicated by the church, you were cast out too. If he raised taxes to build a new wing of his manor, you ate less. Your hunger was a byproduct of his ambition. There was no buying your way out. You had no money, no rights to claim, no court to plead your case. The land was passed among the powerful like relics, and you went with it. You were not consulted. You were included, like a cart, like a well, like a mule. You grew grain but couldn't keep it. You raised livestock but couldn't butcher it. You gathered wood but couldn't chop it without paying. The very forest behind your hut, the one you walked through as a child, belonged to the Lord. And if you took too many branches, they'd take a finger, or a hand, or all your sons. And you never rebelled, not because you didn't want to, but because you didn't know how. You had no weapons, no education, no allies. The land was too big, the lords too many, the system too old. You were trapped, and no one had even told you you were inside a trap. Because when land is power, and power owns everything, you don't just lose your home, you lose the very idea of ownership. You weren't paid, You were tied, bound. Not with ropes, not with chains, but with rules, oaths, expectations carved so deep into society that no one questioned them. You worked the land not because you wanted to, not because someone hired you, but because you were born into that obligation. Your labor wasn't labor, it was rent, it was debt, it was duty, and it started the moment you could stand. No one asked how many hours you worked. No one cared. The day began when the light returned and ended only when it disappeared. You rose in darkness. You staggered into the fields before your body had even warmed. You hauled water, turned soil, mended fences, carried stones. In spring you planted. In summer you weeded. In autumn you harvested. In winter you prayed the food would last. There were no weekends, no holidays unless the church demanded it. And even then, you worked in the morning before you knelt in the cold stone chapel to confess sins you didn't understand. You weren't an employee. You were part of the estate. You belonged to the manor like the ox, like the well, like the ditch behind the stable. If you were lucky, your lord didn't beat you. If you were unlucky, he did, and no one intervened. Because you weren't protected, the law didn't shield you. It managed you. You couldn't sue, you couldn't strike, you couldn't leave. You were a serf, not a slave, they said, but the difference was mostly technical. You weren't bought or sold outright. But you were inherited, traded with the land, counted in inventories. Your children were born into the same status with the same obligations. You couldn't choose your work, couldn't choose your lord, couldn't choose your life. The freedom to choose was something reserved for men with swords and seals. You had neither, and if you tried to walk away, if you gathered what little you owned and crossed the edge of the estate, you became an outlaw, a fugitive, a man without a place, which, in that world, meant a man with no value. You could be hunted, beaten, imprisoned, not because you broke a law, but because you tried to exist outside the one role the system had allowed you. You worked for nothing. No coin, no title, no stake, just survival, just permission to keep living one more season in a system that saw you as labor with a face. You weren't paid, you were used. And when you broke, when your back gave out or your leg snapped or the fever left you coughing blood, you were replaced, quietly, without mention, without loss, because the system didn't need you. It only needed someone like you. Your life wasn't a story, it was a loop. And every year the loop looked exactly the same. You worked, you paid, you obeyed, and then you did it all over again. From the moment the frost melted in early spring, your body was claimed. Not by choice, not by invitation, by expectation. You tilled land that wasn't yours. You planted seeds you had to borrow. You hauled buckets of manure over your shoulder. You spent entire days bent at the waist, sun on your neck, mud in your teeth, skin peeling off your hands. Then the harvest came. But it wasn't a celebration. It was accounting. It was measurement. The grain didn't go to your family first. It went to the Lord his share by law, then to the church a tithe by God, then to the miller a fee by tradition, then to taxes local, royal, arbitrary. What was left, if anything, you took home, not proudly, not joyfully, quietly, and prayed it wouldn't rot before the next planting season. You didn't eat first. Your children did. If there was enough for them to grow, you accepted the fatigue in your own bones. If there wasn't, you watered down the porridge. You boiled stale bread. You chewed slowly so the hunger came later. And still you worked, because hunger didn't matter. The deadline did. The sowing, the reaping, the next delivery, the next collection. The next order barked by the steward with ink on his hands and no dirt under his nails. Obedience wasn't virtue. It was survival. If you spoke out, you were punished. If you resisted, you were exiled. If you organized, you were hanged. So you bowed, you nodded. You made your voice small. You said, "Yes, my lord," even when your son was coughing blood and the taxes were due and the cow had died in the night. You didn't ask for help. You didn't cry, you just worked harder. There was no end to the cycle. No moment when someone said, "You've done enough." No pause, no reward, just the next sunrise and the next task and the next obligation. You didn't save. You didn't rest. You didn't retire, you just got slower, more hunched, more brittle. And then eventually you didn't get up, and that was that. Your children took your place. The wheel kept turning. This wasn't bad luck. It wasn't personal. It was the system, designed to use you until you broke, designed to replace you without blinking, designed to keep spinning, fueled by the silence of people like you. You worked, you paid, you obeyed, you died. And no one ever asked if you wanted anything more. You couldn't read the laws that bound you, not because you were lazy, not because you were stupid, but because no one ever let you learn. Letters weren't for people like you. They were for scribes, for clerics, for judges, for men whose hands had never held a hoe or smelled of dung. The laws were written in Latin, sometimes in French, sometimes in ink so faded it looked like blood left out in the sun. But never in your language, never in words you could understand. So the rules came down by voice spoken by the steward, shouted by the taxman, whispered by the priest. And by the time they reached your ears, they weren't rules anymore. They were threats. You didn't know how many taxes you owed. You only knew when the cart showed up and someone pointed to your sack of grain. You didn't know what a tithe contract was. You only knew that if you missed one Sunday at church, people stared. If you missed two, someone reported you. If you missed three, you were punished. You didn't know what the penalty for stealing wood was until your neighbor lost a hand. You didn't know that trespassing meant stepping into the wrong patch of forest, until your uncle was tied to a post and whipped until his back turned black. The law was not something you looked up. It was something you discovered only when you broke it, and when that happened, no one asked why. No one explained. The punishment came first. The shame came after, a fine you couldn't afford, a public beating, a mark cut into your skin. Maybe even death if someone in power was having a bad week. And there were so many rules. Rules about how much grain to plant, when to pay, where your animals could walk, what you could wear, what words you couldn't say, who you could marry, what you owed the church for your daughter's wedding, your mother's burial, your newborn soul. There were laws inside laws, and they all changed depending on who held the whip, who sat in the manor, who rode through the village in armor you helped polish. And still you obeyed, not out of respect, but out of fear, because to break the law was not just dangerous, it was irreversible. Once you were labeled a criminal, you were finished. No one would help you, no one would feed you. Your name would rot as quickly as your teeth. Your children would carry the shame. Your wife would bury you alone, so you kept your head down, you nodded when told, you worked, you tithed, you apologized for things you didn't understand. You taught your children to listen, not to question. And you warned them every day, be careful, because you never know what law they'll enforce next. In the feudal system, justice was not blind. It was blindfolded only for you. The others, the ones with the pens and swords, they saw everything, especially your mistakes. They told you this was holy. The dirt under your feet, the ache in your back, the hunger in your belly, the silence in your mind, all of it holy. A divine plan. A sacred order. You didn't work in the field because you were poor. You worked because it was your role in God's world. That's what the priest said. That's what the church carved into every sermon, every feast day, every whispered confession. The church wasn't just where you prayed. It was where you were reminded who you were, not just a nobody, a righteous nobody. Your suffering wasn't just pain, it was virtue. Your submission wasn't weakness, it was godliness. Your obedience wasn't fear, it was faith. You were told that heaven was for the humble, that the meek would inherit the earth after they were dead, that every blow you took, every coin you gave, every hour you lost to hunger and cold would be repaid in the afterlife. You just had to endure, just had to keep kneeling, just had to believe. You couldn't read the Bible, it was in Latin. You weren't allowed to question sermons, that was heresy. You weren't taught to interpret anything. You were taught to listen, to repeat, to recite. You crossed yourself when told. You bowed when told. You confessed things you didn't understand, sins you didn't know you'd committed. And in return, you got forgiveness, sold in portions you could barely afford. The church taxed you like the Lord did. A tenth of your harvest, a fee for every rite, baptism, marriage, burial, you owed even in death. If you didn't pay, your soul was left in limbo. Your family was cursed with shame. You couldn't rest, not here, not in the next world. And you believed it, because what else was there? The church had the books. The church had the knowledge. The church had the only answers to the only questions you were allowed to ask. Why am I suffering? Why am I poor? Why do the lords eat while I starve? The answer always was because God wills it. And who were you to argue with God? So you prayed, you knelt, you fasted, you wept. You beat your chest and asked for mercy. And when the winter came early and your child died in the night, you dug a grave and said nothing. Because somewhere in your gut, shaped by years of sermons and fear, you believed maybe, just maybe, that death was a blessing. That poverty was a path. That pain had a purpose. And that purpose wasn't to be questioned. Because in a world ruled by lords and priests, doubt was the only sin they punished harder than disobedience. If you were born a woman in 1200 AD, your world was even smaller, even quieter, even harder. You didn't just belong to the land. You belonged to someone else, first your father, then your husband, and eventually your grave. You didn't inherit land, you didn't vote. You didn't sign, you didn't decide. Your body wasn't yours. Your work wasn't yours. Your voice, if you ever dared raise it, was rarely heard and even more rarely remembered. Your life began with labor, not education, not play, not dreams. You were taught how to bake, how to bleed, how to keep the fire alive. You learned to cook by instinct, to clean in silence, to endure without protest. Your hands never healed. Your feet were swollen, your back stayed bent. You were expected to marry young, sometimes before your body was fully ready. 14 wasn't unusual. 12 wasn't unheard of. You didn't choose your husband. That was arranged. Sometimes for grain, sometimes for livestock, sometimes just to settle a dispute. Your wedding wasn't the beginning of love, it was the beginning of obligation. You were expected to bear children, as many as possible, as soon as possible. No one asked if you were ready. No one asked if you wanted it. You gave birth in the same hut where you slept, bled, prayed, and worked, sometimes with a midwife, sometimes alone, sometimes with another child watching. The pain was immense, the danger constant, and if the child died or if you did, the village moved on. There were always more girls, always more wombs to be filled. When you weren't pregnant, you were recovering, or nursing, or preparing for the next round. And in between, you hauled water. You gathered kindling. You made clothes, repaired tools, salted meat, cleaned wounds. You taught children not to die before winter. You helped bury the ones who did. You made your own soap, your own medicine. You prayed for forgiveness for things you didn't do. And if you were ever accused of gossip, of immodesty, of witchcraft, there was no defense. A pointed finger could become a noose. You couldn't read. You couldn't own. You couldn't walk alone at night. You couldn't speak too loudly in church. You couldn't say no in your own home. And if your husband beat you, that was his right. If he drank the last of the ale and slapped you for not having more, you apologized. If he cheated, you were told to be patient. If he left, you begged the church to let him return because without him you were nothing. No income, no protection, no identity. Your entire worth was in how small you could become, how quietly you could suffer, how well you could pass that lesson on to your daughters. Because in the feudal system, men were property, but women were ghosts, used, seen, and then forgotten. And if you were lucky, very lucky, you died before you truly realized it. What if you tried to escape? What if one night after your children fell asleep on straw that smelled of mold and smoke, you stood up, walked out of the hut and kept walking, past the fields, past the fences, into the woods, away from the Lord, the taxes, the church bells, the cycle, the silence? What then? The answer is simple. You became a criminal, not a rebel, not a refugee, a criminal, a fugitive of the feudal order. Because you weren't just leaving a village. You were abandoning your place in the system. You were breaking the unwritten contract that bound you to the land, the Lord, the God they taught you to fear. You didn't own your body, remember. So if you left without permission, it was theft. You were stealing yourself. They would find you, maybe in a week, maybe in a month. You'd be spotted near a market selling eggs that weren't yours to sell, or sheltering in a monastery stable, too hungry to hide. And when they caught you, because they always did, there was no trial, no second chance. You would be punished in public as a warning. You could be fined beyond what you'd ever earn. Tied to a post, whipped until your skin peeled like bark. You could be branded on the face, the hand, the chest, burned into visibility so that no village would take you again. Or you could be hanged, not because you killed, not because you stole, but because you tried to walk away. And if you somehow got far enough, crossed regions, changed your name, started over, you would still never be safe, because you had no papers, no coin, no property. You couldn't buy land, couldn't marry, couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. You were a shadow. And in a world built on names and ties and permission, being a shadow meant being nothing. So most people didn't run. They thought about it. Quietly at night, when the wind blew and no one was listening. But they stayed. Not because they loved the cage, but because they feared the outside even more. Because freedom was a word that hadn't arrived yet. Because the system taught them that even suffering had structure, and structure felt safer than chaos. So they stayed, and the system stayed, and the chains stayed, and no one ever called it a prison because no one ever saw the door. The cage had no bars, but you never left. Not because you couldn't, but because you didn't know it was a cage. Because when you're born inside something, you don't call it a prison, you call it life. You call it God's will. You call it duty. You call it the way things are. And when every voice around you says the same thing, from your father to your priest to the man who owns your land, you don't argue. You internalize, you bend, you adapt. And so you lived in mud, in hunger, in labor, in silence. You worked fields you didn't own, paid taxes you didn't understand, obeyed rules you couldn't read, prayed to gods you feared more than loved, married who you were told, raised children into the same loop, watched them die, watched others leave, then watched the same seasons return again and again like a wheel that didn't know how to stop turning. You didn't dream of escape. You dreamed of survival, of one more harvest, one less illness. A winter that didn't kill someone you loved. That was enough. That had to be. Because anything beyond that, freedom, ownership, dignity, those were words from stories you never heard. Rights that hadn't been invented yet. Futures you'd never be allowed to live long enough to see. And when you died, which you did, young, quietly, without inscription, the system didn't blink. The land was reassigned. The debt passed down. The hut repaired. The loop continued. You were forgotten, not out of cruelty, but out of design. Because that's what the feudal system was built for, not to crush the many loudly, but to use them completely and discard them quietly. And centuries later, when people romanticize the simple life of the past, when they speak of honor and knights and tradition, they're not talking about you. They never were, because you were the one who kept the fires burning, and no one remembers the hand that held the match.